Great Lakes Prepping here. I've been waiting 10 years to make this video. Well, that's a little misleading. What I should say is that I've been waiting until I hit the 10-year mark before making this video. Let me clarify. 10 years ago is when I really started ramping up my food storage and preservation efforts. And one of the things that I stored a whole bunch of is ordinary all-purpose flour. Now, I know that the general rule is that you're supposed to use flour within a few months or maybe a year or more if you're storing it in the freezer. Flour's got some fats in it that can go rancid, the flour can go stale, you can actually have mold growing in it, and God knows what else. Nevertheless, I wanted to try storing a bunch of it in mason jars like this, much like I would store many dried goods. Though vacuum sealing a fine powder like flour in a mason jar presents some challenges because the action of the suction from your machine wants to draw up some of that powder and dust and kind of obstruct the lid, and it's hard to get a good seal. So I actually did my flour with O2 absorbers and desiccant packs to absorb any, miscellaneous moisture that might be in there. And I've been using my flour here and there between then and now for various things, but I've waited specifically until I hit the 10-year mark, which is basically right now, before making a video about it. I wanted to really kind of put this 10-year-old flour through the paces and make perhaps the thing that the most things could go wrong with, and that's a loaf of fresh baked bread. Sometimes I have a heck of a time making a proper loaf of bread when I've got perfectly brand new flour. We're going to see how the dough comes together, how it rises, bake the whole thing up, see how it smells, see how it tastes, and find out if storing flour like this was a good idea or a complete waste of time and flour. So let's get into this and start making some bread. I'm just using one of my sort of basic go-to white bread recipes. The only difference is I'm using this decade-old flour. The first thing I'll do is get my yeast proofing. I'm using a water and milk mixture for the liquid, and I'm measuring by weight. I'll mention that when I started weighing all of my ingredients for bread making, it changed everything. I used to think I just kind of sucked at making bread, but that's because I was using measuring cups and spoons. Weighing in grams takes any variable right out of the equation, and you always end up with such a better and more consistent final product. Anyway, I'm doing 175 grams of water and 125 grams whole milk. And I'll microwave it for just a few seconds until the temperature is right at about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Don't really go hotter or you'll kill the yeast. Then I'll add 1 packet of yeast, or 7 grams. Give it a light stir and let it sit for 10 minutes. Now for my dry ingredients. I'll weigh out 440 grams of the flour. And then to that, I'll add 20 grams of sugar and 8 grams of kosher salt. Give it all a quick whisk and get that bowl in place on the stand mixer. Once my yeast mixture is nice and foamy, I'm pouring that into the dry ingredients. Now to let the mixer do its thing. I'll start off pretty slow until all the wet and dry have incorporated and turned into a big clump of dough, and then increase the speed to medium and let it go a few minutes. Then I'll add in a tablespoon of butter, then mix for a minute, then repeat 2 more times, so I have a total of 3 tablespoons of butter in there. And then I'll just let the mixer continue kneading the dough on somewhere between medium and medium-high speed for about 5 more minutes. Now to transfer my dough onto a floured surface. And this is where I'm first noticing that something seems a little different. My dough seems to be a bit softer than I would expect at this stage. It's having a hard time keeping any sort of shape, and it's a little stickier than I would expect. Getting a little more flour into it helped with the stickiness and gave it a little more structure, but forming it into a ball was a little tricky, and it's not especially tight. But I'll do the best I can and see what happens. So I'll grease a bowl with some cooking spray, drop in my dough ball, cover that bowl with some plastic wrap, and I'm ready for my first rise. I'll leave it in a warm spot in my kitchen and let it rise for 90 minutes, hoping it will have doubled in size by then. After 90 minutes, I can see that my dough has indeed risen quite a lot, so I'll punch it down to degas it and then transfer it back onto a floured counter. Again, it's a bit stickier than I would expect and still pretty floppy, so I need to pat a little more flour into it just so I can actually handle it. Now I'll roll it out into a rough rectangle that's about as long as my bread pan, and then roll it up with my fingers into a loaf shape, doing my best to tuck in the side edges. Now it's going into a greased bread pan, and we need to let it rise a second time. So I'll cover the bread pan with plastic wrap and leave it alone for another 60 minutes. After the second rise, I can see that things again seem a little weird. The dough has clearly risen a lot, maybe too much. This dough is weirdly loose. I can't think of another word to describe how this dough has been acting. It's not a dense, tight dough. It's floppy. It almost looks like the dough rose an awful lot and then sort of began collapsing back in on itself under its own weight. I have no idea why old flour could cause this to happen, but there's no way I'm not going to bake this thing to see what I end up with. So it's going into a 350-degree oven for 35 to 40 minutes. And after 35 to 40 minutes, I've ended up with something that honestly looks like a pretty decent looking loaf of bread. That floppy dough ended up puffing up pretty well during baking, though I've ended up with these sort of goofy looking overhanging sides. Not that that really matters. After cooling for a short while, it's time to cut in and see what I've got. And it looks just about right. I do think I could have gone another couple minutes in the oven, but all in all, not bad. As for the smell, it's delightful. Nothing weird or off about it at all. It just smells like a delicious, yeasty loaf of fresh-baked bread. I'll say that the bread is very soft, at least as soft as the stuff you'd buy at the store. Now, part of that is the recipe I use. The milk and butter make for a good, soft loaf. But there has definitely been something different about the texture of this dough all along, and I can't help but assume that the 10-year-old flour is behind it. As for the taste, it's perfectly good. It tastes like fresh-baked white bread. There is nothing stale, sour, bitter, or anything else wrong with the flavor. With the possible exception of the weird effect it had on the dough's structure, I wouldn't be able to tell any difference between this flour and brand new flour with regards to the final bread product. Delicious, super soft white bread that tastes and smells great. And I'll put this simple white bread recipe in the description below if you want to check it out. So yeah, I'd have to say I'm pretty pleased with how this came out, and I definitely don't feel like I wasted a ton of flour all those years ago. I'll go ahead and use up the rest of it as soon as possible though, because I don't really have any interest in pushing much past the 10-year mark. I'm more inclined to replenish my supply and just reset the 10-year timer. And I hope you'll be inclined to like and subscribe so you can stay up to date on all our latest stuff, including future bread making and food experiment videos. Thanks for watching, and until next time, this is Great Lakes Prepping.